Okay, well, welcome everyone. I am Brad Lips, the CEO of Atlas Network, and I'm very happy to convene this session on liberalism and the free society, where I will be in discussion with two important leaders in the liberty movement. Adam Bartha, he's the director of Epicenter. Adam coordinates collaborations among this network of 9 of the leading liberal think tanks across Europe. Adam's got a wide range of experience studying in the UK. He's got a master's in political theory from the London School of Economics. He's done party politics in Germany and in Hungary, even spent some time stateside as well in the think tank movement. So great to have you with us today, Adam.
Thanks, Fred. Great to be here.
Yeah, and the second member of our discussion is Salis Maralavicius. If I did that better in rehearsal, Salis. Salis leads some important projects at Lithuanian Free Market Institute's Educational Center, as well as running his own independent organizational consultancy. He's studied at Cambridge, got a PhD in social anthropology, and just very happy to have you bringing your perspectives to our discussion today, Salis.
Hello, everyone. Pleasure to be here.
So I'm looking forward to learning more from both Salis and Adam, but from you as well. We're going to reserve some time for discussion in the second half of this program. So I hope you'll be making use of the chat box to share observations and pose questions as we go. Now, gentlemen, I hope you don't mind if I take the first few minutes here to set the stage for what we're going to be talking about. By talking about a new book of mine, which I wrote to try to spur conversations like the one we're going to be having today. The book is called Liberalism and the Free Society in 2021. You can order hard copies right now via our website or via Amazon, or just for partners. We have a special deal. We can send you a free electronic version of the book. If you follow the link that my colleague Chelsea Schick is putting in the chat box now, you can access the book as a PDF. I wrote this book during a crazy year of lockdowns, realizing that it was very obvious we were in a health crisis, but perhaps it was important to remind people that we are also in a freedom crisis. My big hypothesis is that 2020 could go down as a really pivotal year in world history, perhaps for very negative reasons, but that is not preordained. A lot of history is going to be unfolding in the months and years to come, and we in the freedom movement should take to heart that we are in a high leverage position where we might exert influence over whether the history of this decade is one that will favor freedom or one that will see its decline. I contend that the groups that make up our movement are truly undervalued assets for revitalizing liberal democracy and thereby ensuring a brighter future. And it was fun to put this book together as we celebrate the 40th anniversary of Atlas Network that takes place next month. And I think it provides a good opportunity for us to take stock of our movement. So that's really section 1 of this book. I share some findings, that the combined annual budget of Atlas Network's partners around the world is now a shade over $1 billion annually. So some serious resources involved in this movement. I also share that the typical group, however, is rather modestly funded and rather scrappy. The sort of the median group in our network is about 10 years old, has 7 full-time staff working with a budget under $300,000 US. If it seems unlikely that the world might be changed by such organizations, there's a chapter in this first section that talks about some of the amazing improvements in human freedom that have happened over the past 40 years and explains how our partners have played key roles in those developments. The second section of the book takes stock of the state of the free society, the challenges and opportunities in 2021. And we do this in 2 ways. The first is by looking at indices, some of the ones that many of you in this movement are familiar with, the Economic Freedom of the World report that Fraser Institute puts out, for instance. But it also shares some preliminary findings from the Global Index of Economic Mentality, which is a project I've been involved in over the past year, along with a wonderful Argentine scholar, Carlos Newland, and a Hungarian scholar, Paulus Chagleti. And the formal paper will be in the Cato Journal in the fall of this year. But we preview some of the findings here in the book. And the idea here is that you can mine the World Values Survey, looking at some questions that have to do with how people feel about government's role in the economy, whether market outcomes are fair, and so on. And you can get a sense of the appetite for more government intervention or not. And it's going to be interesting to see as this project evolves, whether this is at all a leading indicator of change in actual economic freedom. I'd make the case that our think tank community is really geared towards influencing economic mentality with the idea that policy change in a positive direction can follow that. The other part of sort of this second section, where we're looking at the challenges and opportunities for the free society, is sort of manifests itself in a bunch of conversations that I hosted with members of our movement in different regions of the world, including one discussion on Europe, where we had some of your colleagues from Sweden and Spain, Greece, Germany, and the UK, all discussing challenges and opportunities. I think you'll find that a really entertaining chapter here in the book. And then the third and final section presents some ideas of my own about the path forward for those who favor the free society. I make the case, and it's really based a great deal on how I see political coalitions shifting inside the United States, but I think there are parallels in Europe. I hope we can explore that a little bit over this hour we have together. But I make the case in the US context that the hyperpolarization that we have been seeing is actually creating an opportunity that can be filled by us in the freedom movement. I think the hard left and the radical cultural right actually feed off one another with competing forms of identity politics, trying to enlarge the power of the state to generate favors for the in-group and to punish parts of the out-group. We in the freedom movement need to resist the temptation of getting sucked into that. We have to remain focused on principles, on our belief in keeping the state focused on the very limited range of tasks that indeed it needs to do well, on the goal of ensuring legal equality for all people and the importance of clearing away barriers to opportunity for all people so they can thrive. So the last chapter of my book is really, hopefully, a bit of a pep talk about why we need to think boldly about how much we can achieve if we really focus on inclusivity, showing our empathy and our authentic belief in the dignity of each person, and also equal justice, drawing a sharp distinction between what we favor and the illiberal idea of trying to use government to generate equality of outcomes, to use government to generate favors for some and punishments for others, with this ideal of fairness that for some reason they think we can design from the top down. So those are sort of the big sections and the themes behind this book. I hope that lots of organizations in our movement will be able to use it to draw attention to the important role that can be played by all the partner organizations that you represent, and that we can spur more enthusiasm to generate support for the kind of work that we've been able to showcase here at the Europe Liberty Forum. So yeah, I hope that that's a good preview of the book, and hopefully something that gets this conversation headed in the right direction. I'm now going to ask Adam to give us 5 or so minutes of his own opening remarks. I do want to acknowledge, however, that I should say that some of the ideas that I'm presenting as my own in the final chapter of the book, I think are really greatly inspired by a talk that Adam gave a couple years ago at one of our Europe Liberty forums. I'm forgetting, Adam, if that was Copenhagen
it's in
or
Athens.
Budapest. It was in Athens. Oh, that's right. Okay, so the most recent one. So Adam, belated thank you for that, and I'll be interested in your further thoughts on this topic.
That's a very kind compliment, Brad. That's really nice of you to say, and thank you for writing the book. I think it's a very important contribution to the debate of the future of the freedom movement. So I'm sure it's going to be read widely across the Atlas network. I see a lot of familiar faces in the Zoom call. So some of you might already know that I spend a lot of my time dealing with the ideas and policies that are linked to the European Union. So Brad, you talked a lot about kind of the theoretical ideas and the larger themes that should be guiding us in the freedom movement. But I want to address kind of the practical issues for a moment. And apologies to all the British and Swiss and Balkans friends who are on the call. I'm going to be focusing a lot on the EU, but I think the EU matters even for non-EU member states across Europe. Just like President Trump or President Biden can have a pretty massive impact on Canada or on Mexico, I think the EU can be a pretty influential neighbor as well. And my main message to classical Europeans across our movement is that we should really stop worrying and just love the bomb. And the EU is here to stay. So irrespective of what pundits for the British Telegraph are going to write when the EU is going to fall apart, or what Republicans might be thinking in the United States, the EU is part of European people's lives. And I think that's likely to remain the case for the foreseeable future. And I think our friends in the United States are doing a really excellent job of wrapping the message of freedom and liberty into kind of a patriotic star-spangled banner to expand the reach of these ideas. And I think we should be doing very similar things here in Europe as well. And we have pretty decent chances to achieve that. Europe is a very diverse, pretty decentralized place if you compare it to the United States. EU leaders have a lot less power than a US president. So keeping the EU in check according to classical liberal principles should be actually an easier job than what our American friends are trying to do in the United States. But the big question is how we do it. And I think based on current trajectories, the EU is very, very popular, especially in younger generations, despite all of its failings. So just to give you a stat, for under 35s in the EU, the Union has an approval rate of 80 or 90%. That's very high considering all the mistakes that EU leaders are constantly doing. So whatever we try to do in the future, I think the solution or part of the solution is trying to out-Europe Europhiles and federalists with pan-European ideas of freedom. I think classical liberals are often fighting against stupid ideas, and we sometimes do lack a positive messaging. So I would like to change that by introducing the idea of the 5 Ds. So during the conversation, if you have any kind of expansion to these 5 Ds, I would very much welcome them. But I think as an introductory kind of idea, it serves our purpose. So the first D is to demand the full return of open borders within the EU without any ifs or without any buts. I think the Schengen zone and the single market are really the backbone of Europe, and they are very, very much aligned with classical liberal principles and the principles of a free society, both in an economic sense and in a social sense. But unfortunately, a lot of the centrist politicians now, after the pandemic, are toying with the idea of restricting free movement of people. And I think the European freedom movement needs to be the loudest voice to demand that we cherish open borders, open internal borders, both for people and goods after the pandemic. And the second D, in my view, should be deepening the single market, especially in finance and digital sectors. So free trade of goods, physical goods, is an important thing. It's great that, German cars produced in Slovakia can be bought by Italians without any kind of import restrictions or trade barriers. But I think the economies are changing. So service sector is obviously becoming a lot more important, and free marketeers are really perfectly equipped to make the case for more Europe, more trade, which in this particular case actually does align with more economic freedoms. The third deed that I would like to highlight is to describe a feasible institutional reform and treaty change in the EU. So everyone in the Brussels bubble is very much aware that the current institutional setup requires change. And I think instead of the kind of mild Euroscepticism and banging the table, shouting, no, 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 like Mrs. Thatcher did, I think European liberals can become the drivers of EU institutional reform and shape the process in a lot more liberty-minded way. If we go back to Hayek, already Hayek described a very, very strong kind of idea of pan-European classical liberalism based on free and liberal European member states. And I think we can bring this old tradition back to the forefront. But part of that is the fourth B, which is decentralizing, decentralizing, decentralizing. It almost seems like a no-brainer for classical liberals to demand further decentralization, but practically that can be a pretty difficult thing to do. But I think we have a good chance of kind of playing various political interests against each other. So I think there are three levels of governance, one pan-European EU one national one, and one of the local level. And I'm very much supportive of the idea of giving the EU somewhat more powers in exchange for national governments to have a lot less of those powers. So I would outsource as much of the kind of competencies to local government structures, whether it's education, whether it's healthcare, whether it's taxation, to truly regional governments, which are a lot more accountable than the big nation states of over-centralized France or over-centralized United Kingdom. And I'm going to be wrapping up because I know that you guys have a lot of great ideas as well. But I think the fifth B, and one of the most important ones, is deciding on our allies. I think Steve Davis's political realignment theory is very much valid. I think the political realignment is well underway, and old allies might not be the most suitable to achieve our goals. So Vox in Spain or the Swedish Democrats might be pretending to favor small government in certain areas, but I think they're very far from proper classical liberal-minded individuals. And I think as the European freedom movement matures, it's really time to leave some of the teenage friendships and friends aside and look for new alliances in the future. And whether it's going to be shaping digital policies of the EU with the help of IBL and Civismo, or highlighting the need for the rule of law by Civil Development Forum at Timbro, I think a lot of the epicenter member think tanks and Atlas partners will be crucial to provide a very positive agenda for the upcoming period that Europe faces. So I'm very excited to hear all of these ideas in the conversation later on.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Adam. Let's turn the podium over to Solis. Solis, have some opening thoughts for our discussion, please.
Hello again, everyone. First, about your book, Brad. I had a privilege to skim through your draft of the book, and I have to say that I have to highlight two things which are impressive in a very good way. Is that, first of all, I had a summarizing impression that this book is a message of hope. And I think that it is exactly the way we should communicate to the world, to the audience, because message of freedom is always have to be a message of hope. And another very good point in your book is that, yes, currently freedom movement is has a lot of challenges, and sometimes it is in a very difficult place. But at the same time, in your book, you touch the approach, the historical approach, not an apocalyptic one. but as a cyclical one. And I think it is a very, very important point, because if we think in an apocalyptical way, that, decline of freedom, decline of Western civilization, or whatever, it paralyzes us to do the good job, to work for the movement. It paralyzes us before the inevitable. But cyclical thinking brings us to the idea that, well, I mean, we are currently in a situation where we have challenges, but we have to mobilize ourselves and work further, knowing that things will improve eventually. So that's these are 2 points which are very inspiring in your book. Now, if only to contribute to the conversation that has already been started with your book, I'd like to give 3 points which will be very different from those of Adam's points, because Adam is a very practical man, and his thoughts are very practical. Mine will be a little bit more anthropological, in the sense that, since I'm an anthropologist, in a sense that we always look for the fundamental starting points. So when I think about freedom movement, I have the first thing that I would like to highlight is that one of the reasons that freedom movement currently is in, I wouldn't say in crisis, but has challenges, is because we have to understand that we are dealing with the situation grand idea versus grand narrative. Grand idea is freedom movement, and grand narrative is actually a Marxist movement. And how come freedom movement is grand idea? Well, the idea of freedom movement and human dignity comes from Hellenistic, as well as Judeo-Christian, Muslim, and the Enlightenment project, the intellectual thought. And to be the advocate of freedom movement, one has to have a basic understanding of philosophical theory, at least basic, fundamental understanding of philosophical theory, political theory, economic theory, and as well as the theoretical law, at least. So it requires intellectual labor. So to believe in that idea, to see that idea implemented, how it can be implemented throughout the world. Now, contrary to that, Marxism is a grand narrative. Grand narrative, those ideas like welfare state and other socialism, everything originates from the Marxist theory. Marx himself borrowed the fabula of his grand narrative from Judeo-Christian tradition, from Christian mystics in particular, and he simply created a secular materialist myth about the better future. And this myth has a hero's journey concept. It has very neatly arranged story of good and evil, of oppressed and oppressor, and the economy of salvation and salvific future. And this is a very neat narrative, and the freedom movement finds itself in a situation where idea is trying to debate the Hollywood movie. And that's a difficult thing to do. And I'm not saying that there are no intellectuals, Marxist intellectuals, quite contrary, there are a lot of them, but you don't have to be an intellectual to be a Marxist. I mean, it is very neat, simple, easy to understand idea, which it is difficult to compete with. Now, another point that I'd like to make is that we have to understand that part of the problem currently freedom movement faces comes from the side effect of secularization project. Yeah, my notes. Sorry. The idea of human freedom comes from the political and economic idea originates from Muslim and Judeo-Christian grand narrative, not the idea, but grand narrative. Secularization, more or less, discredited and disenfranchised grand narratives and religious traditions from creating moral sense in the public sphere. In the private, and that's another story, but in the public sphere. Therefore, now we have what was left was that great grand idea without a grand narrative. And the vacuum has been filled exactly with the Marxist theory. Now we have a situation when the people as moral agents especially young people who want to stay secular but be passionately moral, the only available grand narrative for them is a secular Marxist materialist narrative. So there are things what to do about that, but I'll leave that for the Q&A. And the last point that I wanted to highlight is that is a demographic issue. Demographic point is that when the number of citizens in society steadily decline, government institutions and bureaucratic apparatus remains either the same or grows, and therefore states consolidate greater power. Now, since it is impossible to have an economic growth and prosperity in a situation where the number of economic agents declines, people gradually exchange their insecurities, their economic difficulties for the government's promises of security. So the world never faced this kind of economic crisis probably since the Great Plague. So how it all will play out, we'll see. But overall, if to summarize those, to wrap up those three things, those 3 points that I made, at each point there are things to be done and there are things to be said. But let's leave it for the Q&A. That's my.
No, that's fantastic. You've given us a lot to think about, Salas and Adam as well. So I've got a few questions of my own. I'll also make sure to invite all of you in our audience who'd like to be part of this conversation. Please type questions into the chat box. I'll try to incorporate those, or if you want to voice them yourselves, I'll call on you from here. But let me maybe start by asking Salas to maybe expand a little bit on this, the second point you were making, which I find really intriguing. And it reminds me of something that we've discussed at Atlas, that as the world becomes more abundant in terms of material progress, perhaps the old graphs that we like to show about free markets correlating with prosperity, maybe these don't have the power that they used to. I think this kind of resonates with your idea that, within a secular society with young people still wanting to be seen as moral agents, they're looking for a grand narrative, and Marxism offers that. If the real scarcity now is one of meaning, I'm curious about how people in this this session feel we can fill that void. And maybe Salas, to you, I wonder how you look at it. Do you think that we need to reverse the secular trend in Europe? Is that part of recapturing the grand narrative, or can our movement, which is largely secular, can we develop our own, what Hayek called it, the courage to be utopian and to project a grand vision that inspires people to work for our ideals? How do you look at that question?
Well, thank you. This is a very valid and good question. First of all, it is impossible to reverse the secularization trend, and nor would you have to do that. What we have to do is we have to understand or listen to those who say that we are currently not in a secular state, but in a so-called post-secular state. And within the post-secular paradigm, we have to understand that to do good things in the freedom movement, is not necessary. Secularity as a disposition, as a stance, is not probably a necessary requirement anymore. So in your book, you talk about unlikely allies, and I think this is exactly where religious and secular people can join the same projects, a love of freedom, without finding a controversy in itself, so among themselves. So, and of course, it is we have to resist any kind of utopia and leave utopia to Marxism, since we had a fair share of utopians throughout human history. But what we can do, as I said, we have to understand that the secularity is probably no longer a necessary requirement for liberal thinking, and Acton Institute as a phenomenon is a good illustration of that. Now, what we can do to create good narratives. I don't think we can outcompete Marxist meta-narrative. No, we have to do that. What we can do, we have to create a small narratives about vernacular hopes, vernacular situations, and and use it like a testimonies of success, of hope, and in a very small way, just like the freedom movement has a number of small documentaries, for example, about and by the way, as it is in your book, you present some small inspiring cases about what happens in this or that society with this or that family, and I think it's this kind of message of hope is the way forward, and these small non-intellectual implementations of freedom idea are communicable and are able to compete with the abstract Marxist grand narrative.
So, Liz, do you mind if I just add one quick point to
Sure,
this
sure.
About the grand narrative? I agree with your last point completely. I think we need the small steps and the small kind of personalized cases of freedom that helps a lot. But I'm not sure it's impossible to create a grand narrative for free market liberals, right? So if we think in, grand utopias, fair enough, Marxism was a grand utopia that went in a horrible way. And I'm sure that many of us would predict that the next trials of Marxism are going to go in an equally horrible way. But if we try to create the kind of free market liberal utopia, I think it would be possible to do. And my kind of, very controversial take on this would be to become, as society, as a global society, so stinky rich and wealthy and knowledgeable that we're going to just become like a global interplanetary species with unimaginable kind of ideas and technology and wealth and just human knowledge, right? I mean, we have developed so much in the past 200 years, partially thanks to capitalism, partially thanks to the free flow of ideas, that I don't see any reason why this should be slowing down or why we should be kind of limiting this wealth and knowledge and development to small nation states, and why that can't, grow infinitely, for example. But I think, that's kind of the utopian, techno-utopian idealist version, but maybe with certain sections of society, that could be a grand vision that we all aim towards.
It's interesting because we've just seen in the comments, one of our friends from Ukrainian Students for Freedom has posed a question about objectivism and whether Ayn Rand's ideas provide the basis for an inspiring narrative that could capture more hearts and minds. And maybe I'll throw out an additional idea for both of you to react to, because I think that the Randian vision certainly has brought a lot of sort of hardcore freedom champions into our movement. I've become a little skeptical about the ability to sway sort of a more general audience with her sort of call to redefine altruism and some of these things that are a little bit more esoteric, I'd say. So I'd love to hear your reaction to that as it maybe relates to Adam's idea of like, let's envision the super prosperous, innovative society that we have in our dreams, and let's market that. I sometimes think that the meta narrative needs an enemy, which Marxism certainly has. And another question I would want to throw out, and it does come through in Rand's novels, and she paints a very malicious foil to her heroes. And I sometimes wonder whether we shouldn't be finding common cause with some on the left who rail against what they see as sort of big business capitalism, where I think we can often see that it's not the free enterprise we favor that they're objecting to. It's the collusion, the cronyism that happens between the nexus of big government and big business. So I kind of wonder whether that needs to be part of the meta narrative that we're putting out, that we actually do see that things are unfair, and to call out that cronyism. So I'm not sure where you guys want to begin with that, but Salas or Adam, anybody want to raise their hand to make some comments? Yeah, Salas, you want to start?
Well, I'd like to thank you, Adam, for your comment. I'd like to react to Adam's and then Brad's together. First of all, well, I don't think, well, it is possible to create a grand narrative and utopian narrative, even of prosperity and technological advancement. The peculiarity is that freedom movement everywhere and prosperity everywhere is not something very universal and easily definable as Marxism is. It is always extremely vernacular thing. What the prosperity, the challenges that we face, historical tradition from which we come. So the prosperity is always vernacular, so probably the only possible way for the grand narrative not to be utopian, because I think that utopian narratives should be avoided because they are oversimplified and overgeneralized. So the best thing that we can do is to have a basics of a narrative, fundamentals of a narrative, which we already have. So we only have to compile maybe and market it a little bit more fancy way. But always remember that success, prosperity are vernacular, has vernacular expressions. Now, I forgot. Sorry, I forgot. Brad, if you take over.
Sure, we can also have Adam chime in, but if it triggers your memory, just objectivism and the need for a foil to identifying cronyism as our enemy. Those are some of the ideas that I'd love to hear some more reactions to.
I remember when I studied in Cambridge, I had hours and hours and endless hours of discussions with really passionately Marxist people, very sincere, very good people, moral agents, real passionate moral agents. And I realized that, these are very good people. And what they are fighting, examples that they provide of evils or wrongdoings of capitalism, I'm passionately against as well. So the problem is that exactly what you said, a cronyism in capitalism. And I remember we had courses and classes everywhere and about capitalism in America and what's wrong with that. And always they would come up with a case of Aramco company and all the issues with that. And all those analysis, all this analysis was correct. So I realized, guys, cronyism is evil, and we discussed that cronyism is wrong. Capitalism is not necessarily and definitely not about cronyism. We have to resist that. And probably what you say, unlike the allies, might be those people those Marxist guys most definitely would not object to a small family businesses, enabling small families taking their own future in their own hands without the necessity of big government. These are the issues that people would agree with on the left. And especially when the left now is increasingly radicalized, I think there's a momentum to start a discussion with those moderate thinking young people.
Yeah,
Adam,
definitely.
I was going to say, Adam, you've talked for a while about deciding who our allies are, finding unlikely ones. Where do you want to take this conversation?
I think the cronyism is a very good start, right? There's going to be universal acknowledgement among social democrats in Europe and libertarians that corporate cronyism can be a massive problem, especially in post-Soviet, post-communist countries. The way the 90s kind of liberalizing process went, you can definitely accuse a lot of them with cronyism and how some people got rich, which is a massive problem. But I think you also kind of have to incorporate in the discussion that cronyism happens within government as well, right? If we look at post-communist countries, how they operated pre-1989, if you were a small bureaucrat in a local kind of governance institution, you had pretty significant powers because you could determine where certain regulations are applicable or where they're not, how certain money flows somewhere. But I think besides cronyism, there are so many other issues that we can use to find unlikely allies. I think I mentioned open borders as one of the key policies that Europeans, at least internally, should be striving towards, right? And their green parties, social democratic parties, of course, liberal parties in Europe are going to be very much the allies of the freedom movement. But I think when we're talking about free trade, for example, we often bash bureaucrats in Brussels for good reason. But for example, in trade, I think a lot of the bureaucratic mentality is better than the political mentality across nation states. So sometimes bureaucrats and the European Commission are unlikely allies in promoting free or at least freer trade than currently possible. Same with cutting back red tape. I think the Nordics are often described in the United States as kind of a leftist, almost semi-socialist places, but it couldn't be further from the truth when it comes to red tape and regulation. I think a lot of those countries have much sensible regulatory frameworks than Anglo-Saxon countries, and they have a very high taxation and high wealth redistribution. But on regulation, I think they're very decent. So I think it's worth to kind of restructure our way of thinking when it comes to searching for political allies. And the more we broaden that pool of available groups, political movements, organizations, I think the more likely it is that we're going to get that 50% plus one when it comes to the actual votes in parliaments, when it comes to majority support across society, which is very important. I mean, our ideas might be great, but if only 15% of the population likes them, it's not very sustainable that we're going to be able to implement them in the long term for the foreseeable future.
Well, I'm sort of intrigued by bringing up open borders within the EU as a priority, because I've always seen the immigration debates as one that's been really polarizing within our ranks, and we tend to sometimes avoid the conversations that are polarizing. But I came to regret that we hadn't maybe done more on this front back sort of at the peak of the migration crisis within Europe in 2017 or 18 or so. It seemed that the lack of answers among classical liberals was really unsatisfying. It sort of came up in the conversation in that the Europe regional discussion within the book. Karin, who used to run Timbro in Sweden, sounds a pretty pessimistic note when she says that we've had this reprieve from this conversation during COVID with everyone locked down, but it's likely to come roaring back. And she had seen the immigration debate as one that sort of fueled, especially right-wing populism. So I sort of wonder if that might be a more difficult question, maybe especially after we have questions of percentages of vaccination among populations flowing over borders. I don't know. Any reactions to that?
I'm very worried about the impact of the pandemic on this. As you have mentioned, this whole kind of vaccine debate is going to be an extra additional problematic layer when we're talking about immigration. I think the topic is twofold. One, for starters, we have open borders between EU member states, which is great, and I don't think we should get rid of them at all. Some mainstream politicians are now discussing it. I think it's a massive problem. Some of you might know Michel Barnier, who was the Brexit negotiator and is now running for French presidency. He's talked about abandoning Schengen and then controlling migration from EU countries into France in the future. I think that's a very, very bad route to go down on. But the second layer is kind of immigration from outside of EU countries, right? The 2015 kind of Syrian crisis really brought that to the forefront of European discussion. I think some European leaders took a very commendable risk, and I'm talking about Angela Merkel here, basically saying, these are refugees, we are rich European countries, we have a moral duty to help them and to kind of integrate them long-term into European countries. And I think the Syrian refugees proved that it's possible. 90% of them learned German within the last 5 years. Over 70% of them have now a full-time job. I think it has been a massive success from purely an outcome-based judgment. If you base it on the kind of political discussions, I think it created significant political problems for the German government and for the kind of European Union itself. I think a lot of Eastern European member states were strongly, vehemently opposing it. So it created kind of an East-West division that was already there before, but it became significantly more problematic. And of course, it created kind of incentive for politicians to oppose any kind of migration, because they say if we have completely open borders towards anyone on the globe, what if 2 billion international refugees or economic migrants are going to come here? I think Chandran Kukatas is a perfect kind of free market, classical liberal academic to follow on migration issues. He has explained it in many books and detailed publications, why it's unfeasible for a large number of people to immigrate into rich nations, and how even in a completely open, global open border setup, there wouldn't be massive numbers of people arriving either to the United States or the EU. So I'm afraid it's more of a kind of political point scoring discussion than an actual practical discussion. But I think we do have a moral duty to say, if people are happy to come and integrate and work, then I don't see a reason for government to step in and prevent them from doing so.
You've got yourself muted right now, but we'd love to hear your thoughts, maybe also in connection to the demographic decline questions you were mentioning earlier.
Yeah, well, I agree with everything what you said, Adam, and actually even more. So I have to say that question of immigration will stay on the table for quite a long time, because contrary to the United States probably, and in Europe probably contrary to Poland, all other Eastern European countries, especially, well, Lithuania as well, but Latvia and Estonia as well, and other Eastern European countries are getting increasingly depopulated. Demographic decline is also like a red dot, which nobody wants to talk about. But the reality is that sooner or later, all of these countries will have, like it or not, they will have it. Will have to open its borders for the immigration, whether inside or outside the European Union. Inside, we can migrate, as you already said, but we still will have to open our borders to the outside immigration, because simply we don't have enough demographics even for the labor market. So when we talk about the labor market and economic growth, it is impossible to sustain economic growth if we simply do not have enough labor power. So probably whether you like this idea or not, this idea will stay on the table, and sooner or later we'll face the challenge of immigration, and then all the repercussions that we'll have to deal with that, and governments will sooner or later admit that.
I know we have a question from our friend from Turkey, Medeni. Are you able to unmute yourself, Medeni, to ask your question?
Yes, thank you so much, Brad.
Perfect.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was very illuminating to hear both Adam and Solius. I just wanted to add something and ask a question to Adam about his previous comments on finding unlikely allies in Eurocrats, especially with regards to trade. Hey, by the way, Adam, it's great to catch up here.
Great to see you.
Well, I absolutely agree that cronyism is a great starting point to find unlikely allies, but I also found in my own experience that that conversation easily slips into more regulation. I mean, we are seeing and experiencing an incredible example of that, the cronyism in Turkey right now. So it's an incredible platform to find all sorts of allies, to create great corporations, great networks from other walks of lives. But the discussion easily slips into more regulation under the disguise of rules, we need to create more laws, etc., etc. How would you comment on that? Or do you think we should avoid at all? Thank you.
I mean, I feel your pain completely because I encounter the same things. But in my experience, the best way to counter the narrative is just to provide the empirical evidence. I mean, if you compare France to the Baltic countries, France is constantly trying to reinvent its competition policy and industrial policy to kind of battle the big companies and cronyism within the country. It just simply doesn't work because it's a top-down design. They're trying to create losers and winners if they feel that some of the current winners got there in a problematic or unjustified way. And I think it's in stark contrast with some of the Nordic and now also Baltic countries and their policies. I think if you have a very kind of thin regulatory framework with a low taxation environment, a very tax-savvy society that's able to compete on knowledge and merit, if you look at Estonian companies and Estonian startups, there is a significantly higher number of Estonian startups than French ones when it comes to certain digital sectors. And the size of the two countries is just incomparable. So if you, at least in my experience, if you provide some empirical evidence to the more bureaucratic-minded folks within our wider reach, they're usually reasonably happy to consider and discuss. They might not be convinced instantly. I think it's a gradual process, but I think empirical evidence does work with technical regulators. The incentives often, unfortunately, don't align. Regulators are there to regulate. If they don't have a job, then they're going to be very unhappy. But I think that European Union style regulatory framework that takes a much longer time. It usually incorporates a wider area of stakeholders, and it's very differently implemented in EU member states. I think that's much easier to deal with than the more centralized national governmental crackdown if a new party gets elected and gets into power and it was in their manifesto that they're going to bankrupt Google or Facebook, then they're more equipped to do so than the European Union is. Similar ideas come into the European regulators' mind, but I think it's an easier discussion in my experience than with some of the national politicians, to be fair.
Thanks for that, Adam. We're about 7 minutes away from needing to close this session. So I wanted to turn Salas's attention to this question that's emerged in the chat box so we can at least briefly address it, having to do with, particularly for Eastern Europe, is there a skills shortage or brain drain, and what can countries of Eastern Europe be doing to prevent that? Any thoughts on that question?
In terms of demographics, right?
Yes.
Well, first of all, yes, there has been and still is a huge brain drain. And to my judgment, all the attempts to stop that brain drain failed, and it will fail because people want to find the best place for themselves with their knowledge and competences, especially because salaries in Lithuania cannot compete with European, Western European salaries. Now, is there a shortage of competences? I don't know. Well, most of the foreign businesses that come here, basically they are those back office services, like all that stuff that comes with back offices. So Lithuanians are quite qualified in that. But the problem is, it's not again, we have to understand that the best economic manuals about the economic growth and prosperity that we know of, and best theoreticians, economic theoreticians, those who we favor in the freedom movement, they grew up and studied and wrote their manuals and books during the time of baby boom generation, which means that the zeitgeist of that time was that demographics is growing. And now the zeitgeist is that we have to realize that demographics is no longer growing. And if we increase the efficiency in acquiring skills, if all the brains that have been drained to other countries would arrive, we still don't have enough demographics to sustain economic growth. And that's a gruesome reality, which people in those countries like Lithuania, especially Latvia, Estonia as well in the line, they don't want to talk about that, because for a politician in a for a 4-year cycle politician, these problems are unsolvable. But so the reality is that the only way to solve that actually to open up ourselves for the immigration.
Well, thank you for that, Salis. I was going to say that one thing that is at least a positive that perhaps can be built on, and I was thinking about some discussion we had prior to starting the public conversation about the fragility of organizations in our movement in Eastern Europe, and even groups as accomplished as LFMI, are still really fragile in the large sense, and we all need to continue to try to grow the support base for the movement as it exists, certainly globally, but maybe in Eastern Europe particularly, because one thing that's exciting that comes out of the Global Index of Economic Mentality that's featured in the book is that while it doesn't show up necessarily on the overall rankings, when you actually just segment out the survey data we collected and look only at the populations under 40, once you do that, the countries that are ranking highest in economic mentality, meaning most favorable to free enterprise, most suspicious of government intervention, are almost all from Eastern Europe. So maybe a great credit to the organizations in our network who've been mobilizing youth in these countries, and an opportunity, I think, to build on for the future, I hope. But as we've heard in this discussion, there's a lot of big challenges out there ahead. And thank you very much to Adam and to Salis for your contributions to this discussion today. That's all the time we have for this session. So thank you to everyone who joined us. I hope we got your mind turning on some of these big questions that confront our movement. If you would like to get an electronic copy of the book, I'll ask Chelsea if she can to paste that link back into the chat one more time. There's actually a short form to fill out, but the form gives you some space to let us know how you might be planning to use this book. Would you want me to join you on a podcast that you hope? Do you plan to review the book in your organization's newsletter? We'd love to just get a sense of and then track the ways that you might be able to help us bring more attention, I suppose, bigger audiences to the work of the freedom movement. So thank you in advance for any ideas you have on that front. In the meantime, another little virtual round of applause for Adam and Salis for a really rewarding conversation today. The final session of Europe Liberty Forum 2021 is coming up in just about 60 seconds. That session will feature a conversation on media in difficult times. So head over there now and I will catch you there. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.